we are honored to work with this group of 17 teens from the Education Coalition of Asian American Representation. The Perpetual Foreigner Series has been created and organized by them. It is timely. ECAAR's commitment to educating the community is one of the things that caught our attention at KCLS. I now turn it over to members of ECAAR who will introduce part 2 of the Perpetual Foreigner Series.
All right, so I'm part of the first group. My name is Garrett, and I will be introducing the Perpetual Foreigner Part 2, I guess. So, hi everyone, welcome to Perpetual Foreigner Part 2. The first half of the seminar is called A Systemic Pursuit, and it discusses the Supreme Court and AAPI's legal fights for equality. Throughout, we will see this theme of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and you guys will kind of see what that means once we get into it, and we will explain this a little more later. First, I want to do a land acknowledgement, and just Mercer Island and most of Seattle is on stolen Duwamish land, and we should recognize that before we do any events on the soil. And then we also want to be completely transparent. Specifically mentioned groups include Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Black Americans, and white Americans. And then before we go further, I'm going to link the presentation in the chat if I can. And actually, I'll just link it afterwards, and then I'll hand it off to Jada.
Okay, thank you, Garrett. Hi, everyone. My name is Jada. And just as a little bit of audience interaction before we really get into this presentation, you can just go ahead and type in the chat, or if you're not comfortable, just think in your head, what comes to mind when you think about the Supreme Court? This is just kind of an exercise to jog your mind before we start talking about cases. So I'll just give you a little bit of time to kind of think about that. So when we were putting this presentation together, one of the things a theme that came up to us was white supremacy. And that's something that you're going to see in some of these cases and kind of an idea that you should revisit after this presentation is over. And now I'll turn it over to Anna.
I'm Anna, and this is a list of cases we will discuss in our presentation. There should be a poll now asking what cases you are familiar with or know about. So go ahead and complete that.
All right, if you're not finished with the poll, that's okay. But I want to do a little bit of explaining about the background of the Supreme Court before we go any further. So, as you probably already know, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States of America, but I just want to talk about how does a case wind up at the Supreme Court. So basically, as you can see on this slide, the first step is having a legal issue. This can be criminal or civil, but you want to take someone to court for some reason. The person that has a legal issue is known as the plaintiff, and that vocab word is going to be used later on in this presentation. So next, there's 2 basic categories of courts that exist in the United States. There's federal courts and there's state courts. So most things start at the state level. There are some that don't, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. So as you can see in step 2A, the first place your case is going to go is to a local trial court. This is the first time that your case is ever going to be heard. If the case is heard and the outcome is the way that you want it, you're done there. But if the issue that you have, the court doesn't want to hear it, they throw the case out, you would go to step 2B. This is the appeals court. A court of appeals, the purpose of this kind of court is to review a decision made by another court. If that still didn't go the way that you wanted, you could go to the state Supreme Court. This is the highest court in your state, but it is separate from the federal court. They hear different kinds of cases, but sometimes you can have a case that would go past the state Supreme Court, to the federal court. And that is how you get to step 3. Now, if your case still isn't heard, that is how you get to the Supreme Court. As you can see under step 4, the Supreme Court hears less than 200 cases a year. It's very difficult to get a case to the Supreme Court, and they only pick a handful of cases for different categories. The Supreme Court functions as a court of appeals. However, they can hear original cases if the United States is a party. But for all of the court cases that we're going to be talking about today, they're court of appeals cases. So in this graphic, you can kind of see what I was talking about. This is a better visual. All of the cases in the column on the far right, the Court of Military Appeals, Court of Claims, those are cases where the United States would be a party, and you can see that it goes straight to the Supreme Court. Cases we're going to be talking about today fall underneath the middle column or the left column. And hopefully that gives you a better understanding of the Supreme Court so we can get into the rest of the presentation.
All right, so the first case we're going to be talking about is known as Yick-Wo v. Hopkins. Just as an intro, this is the case that ruled it unconstitutional for non-directly racist rules to be implemented if the impacts are actually racist. And that's a little bit of a confusing concept, but I'll explain that further later. Yick-Wo v. Hopkins was decided in 1886, but the tale actually begins starting in 1880. Basically, the city of San Francisco passed the ordinance you can see on your screen. This is the verbatim text, and you guys can read it later on your own since we'll link the presentation in the chat, but I'll summarize it for now. Essentially, the ordinance stated that if a laundromat was made out of wood, as you can see on the screen, you would need a permit from the city of San Francisco to operate. The reason for this, as it claimed, was that the heating of hot water used in laundromats was a potential hazard since the wood could burn in an accident, which is obviously a disaster for the city. Though the ordinance is not explicitly racist, like it doesn't just say, oh yeah, Chinese people aren't allowed to have laundromats, there are two main reasons why it is racist, just indirectly. First, 89% of San Francisco's laundry businesses were Chinese operated, so the law actually affected Chinese people more than any other ethnic group. And in this way, we can see that the law is targeted racially. Secondly, out of all of those businesses, not a single Chinese-owned laundromat got a permit, restricting them from being run legally, despite having done everything required to get a permit. The city just didn't want to give them a permit, and it was very clearly racially motivated since non-Chinese-owned laundromats were approved. It's important to understand that at this time in 1880, people of Chinese descent had no other means of getting money. If Chinese people could not run their laundromat, they either starved, moved back to China, which was the goal of the ordinance, or ran their businesses illegally. So this brings us back to Yick-Wo. So Yick-Wo was a man who owned a laundromat and they couldn't get a permit. So rather than starve or emigrate, he decided to operate his laundromat anyway. He did this with another man, Wo Li. Each man was fined for $10, which is worth $255 today. Both men refused to pay the $10 because it's like really expensive. It's $255. Who wants to pay that? And the sheriff, Peter Hopkins, hence the name Hopkins in the latter part of the case title, Yick-Wo v. Hopkins, detained them without trial. Both men sued for the violation of habeas corpus, which is a law basically saying arrested people have a right to a trial, which is something that neither Yick-Wo or Wo Li got. They argue that the ordinance violated their rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And basically what that is saying habeas corpus is like a thing in the Constitution, is essentially what it does. The case was rejected by the Supreme Court of California and by the U.S. District of California Circuit Court of Appeals, since the law was not explicitly racist. But finally, the case was heard by the Supreme Court of the United States, and in a unanimous decision, Justice T. Stanley Matthews wrote the following: if it is applied and administered by public authority with an evil eye and an unequal hand, so as practically to make unjust and illegal discriminations between persons in similar circumstances, material to their rights, the denial of equal justice is still within the prohibition of the Constitution. Basically, if that's very dense legal language, it's okay. It's basically a ruling on the side of Yick-Wo saying that you can't have a law that even if the language of the law isn't explicitly racist, but the effect of it still is unconstitutional. So now let's look at the legacy of Yick-Wo v. Hopkins. Right after the decision didn't really change much of anything because the doctrine of separate but equal was adopted and upheld by the Supreme Court. Additionally, Yikwo v. Hopkins was not primarily race-based. It had more to do with the right to property and work regarding a violation of habeas corpus in its original language. While modern interpretations use this case as a way to target indirectly racist laws, the original text has much less to do with this fact. And as a result, it was inapplicable to Jim Crow laws, especially since Jim Crow targeted Black Americans and the San Francisco Ordinance targeted Chinese Americans. The case was not widely used until 70 years later in the civil rights era, and it has been cited in over 150 cases since then. Nonetheless, while this was a significant case at the time, it remains more of a footnote of history.
The next case we're going to be talking about is Wong Kim Ark versus the United States. Wong Kim Ark was born in the United States to Chinese citizens, and he left to visit his parents when he was 21 and they had moved back to China. When he returned to the US, customs officers denied him entry to the US by claiming that he was not a citizen. Ark sued for the violation of habeas corpus as he was detained without trial, and it went to the Supreme Court because he was suing the US Customs Office. This case was argued March of 1897 and was decided 1 year later, which is surprisingly long for what is considered one of the more straightforward Supreme Court cases. The court sided with Wong Kim Ark and set the precedent of jus soli, or citizenship of children born in the US to non-citizen parents. Because Ark was born in the United States and his parents were not employed in any diplomatic or official capacity under the Emperor of China, the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment automatically made him a US citizen. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment was ratified July 9th, 1868, and reading the verbatim excerpt on the slide, it seems pretty clear on the concept of jus soli. Regardless, Wong Kim Ark's case needed to go all the way to the Supreme Court to be defined, likely because he was of Chinese descent. The lasting impact of this case has given citizenship to many Americans over the years, which is 2 steps forward of progress, but this case likely came from a place of bias, which is 1 step back.
So the next case that I want to talk about today is called Lau v. Nichols, and Anna actually led me into this case pretty well because she talked about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment has multiple different clauses. The one she just talked to you about was citizenship. However, the 14th Amendment also provides equal protection and was used in Brown versus Board of Education, which integrated the school system. So what does that have to do with this case? I will talk about that in this next slide. So essentially, this case was argued in 1973. This was a little bit less than 10 years after integration happened and schools were forced to integrate and segregation was ended with the court case I just talked to you about. So the South specifically, but all of the United States was really unhappy about this because Jim Crow was still ongoing and people of color were not welcome in all white schools. This was the case in San Francisco, California. They had a large population of Chinese American students and they were forced to integrate their schools, but they didn't want to. This is the foundation of the case because, like Garrett was saying earlier, they put into place a law that was not strictly and inherently racist, but it was enforced in a way that was racist. What they did was that they refused to provide English language instruction to limited English-speaking children. Unfortunately, most of the children in that school district that were limited English speaking were Chinese American. And so this law that they had put into place directly affected those children and was the San Francisco school district's way of trying to retaliate against being forced to integrate their schools. There were a little under 2,000 children that were affected by this, and that's how it ended up going to the Supreme Court. So fortunately, the end result of this case was positive. The Supreme Court voted unanimously that what San Francisco School District did was wrong and that it violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was huge because it expanded the protections of people of color, specifically Asian Americans, under this ruling. Also, it was a big deal because it led the way for later civil rights movements. So now I'm going to talk about our next court case, which also involves the civil rights movement. So this court case is Patterson versus McLean Credit Union. And before I get into the facts of this case, I want to talk to you about the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is not a very commonly known civil rights act. This is because it was passed during a period of time called Reconstruction. Now, what is Reconstruction? Reconstruction occurred right after the Civil War ended. It was basically a period of time where the government passed a lot of laws trying to extend rights to Black Americans and pay reparations after slavery was abolished. One of the ways that the government did this was by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This gave Black Americans more rights. Now, Section 1981 of this act, you can see on the screen, basically prevented discrimination based on race or ethnicity in making and enforcing contracts. So now that I've talked to you about what that Civil Rights Act is, let's talk about how it fits into the context of this case. So the story of the case is that there was a woman, her name was Brenda Patterson. She is the plaintiff, as I talked to you about the vocab term earlier. She worked at McLean Credit Union, and she alleged that she had faced discrimination at the workplace. She said that she had been harassed, and not only had she been harassed, she had never been promoted at McLean Credit Union despite working there for 10 years. And even though she had never been promoted, her white colleagues had been promoted even though she had more working experience than they did. She brought these concerns to her employer and they fired her. And this is when she took it to the court. So the district court that she went to refused to hear her case, and she went through all of the levels of the court system that I talked to you about earlier until her case finally made it to the Supreme Court under what's called a writ of certiorari, which basically just means that she asked the Supreme Court to review the case. So the outcome was that the Supreme Court did review her case and they threw it out. They sided with McLean Credit Union. The important part of this is that the Supreme Court ruled that the Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act I talked to you about earlier did not extend to private employers. This was a huge deal because while Brenda Patterson was a Black woman, Asian Americans face the highest rate of discrimination in the workplace. So this ruling by the Supreme Court extended and expanded the ability of private employers to discriminate against people of color and specifically Asians. However, this case was retroactively changed in the Civil Rights Act of 1991, where they ruled that what the Supreme Court did was wrong, but that was decades later and the damage was already done.
This next case is Hirabayashi versus the United States, which was argued in May of 1943 and decided in June of 1943 during the peak of World War II. As a result of World War II and conflict with Japan, President Roosevelt issued 2 executive orders, one of which gave the Secretary of War the ability to designate, quote, military areas, unquote, and to exclude people from them. The other executive order established the War Relocation Authority, which could remove people from said military areas and could manage the excluded people. Gordon Hirabayashi, a student at the University of Washington, was convicted of violating both a curfew and a relocation order issued for Japanese Americans. He appealed his case all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously against Hirabayashi, and Chief Justice Stone argued that racial discrimination was justified in a time of war because of the so-called solidarity that individuals of Japanese descent felt with their motherland. Both of Hirabayashi's convictions were overturned 40-some years later because evidence arose that the Solicitor General's office had cited examples of Japanese American sabotage in its Supreme Court arguments that had found to be fake. So the United States lied in their Supreme Court arguments and was ruled in favor of. In 2012, 4 months after Hirabayashi's death, President Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Okay, so the second to last case that we're talking about is very similar to Hirabayashi, and actually the story begins in the same way, with FDR signing Executive Order 9066 to intern Japanese people. I want to note that these cases, in these cases, we see a theme of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that during peace times, Asian Americans make civil rights advancements, as we saw with Yik Wo and Lau v. Nichols, excuse me. But then once war breaks out or something goes wrong, we can see that Asians are the first group to be blamed for it. And this isn't just a theme with Japanese internment or with the Supreme Court. It's a theme with all of American history in San Francisco during the bubonic plague scare, during the Vietnam and Korean Wars. during the Asian Exclusion Acts, during 9/11, and even today with COVID-19. This gets explored more deeply later in our seminar series, but it's something to keep in mind that AAPI are the perpetual scapegoat. Okay, so back to the case. Fred Korematsu refused to be interned, and he got plastic surgery, changed his name, and pretended to be a completely different race. However, this didn't really fool US authorities who had him on record, and he got arrested a few months later. Korematsu contested his arrest, and it was appealed all the way to the US Supreme Court. They ruled that Japanese internment was a, quote, military necessity and that it was not racist. Justice Jackson ended up dissenting and argued that it violated the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, writing Korematsu has been convicted of an act not commonly thought a crime. It consists merely of being present in the state whereof he is a citizen, near the place where he was born, and where all his life he has lived. Korematsu's name ended up being cleared in 1983 on the federal level, but the Korematsu v. United States ruling still stands to this day. It was never reheard by the United States Supreme Court, and it was never overturned. Therefore, there's actually standing precedent that says that if there's a quote unquote grave and imminent danger to public safety, the president has the authority to execute orders that take drastic action to intern people of a certain race. And then, okay, so now on to the most controversial legal battle we're going to be presenting on, affirmative action. And I know a lot of people might be mad about our take on this, but I'm convinced we have enough evidence to back it up. So just hear me out. If you don't know what affirmative action is, there's a definition on the screen. It's basically that people of a certain race, gender, or some other factor that makes them historically discriminated against are favored over those who are not necessarily historically discriminated against. In 2014, Students for Fair Admissions sued Harvard University for unfairly discriminating against Asian American students, saying that AAPI applying to Harvard had a lower chance of getting in than other POC with the exact same application. POC are people of color. And they claimed that this was racist. They wanted to strike down affirmative action, but the court ended up siding with Harvard. There are four main reasons that everyone should understand as to why the court did this. First, the lawsuit and Students for Fair Admissions was run by a straight white conservative man named Edward Bloom. It was very clear that he was not suing on moral grounds because he had tried to make this case previously with a white girl and received very little sympathy. At the time, he wanted to mobilize the AAPI community. Secondly, affirmative action is built on the premise that there will always be too many qualified candidates. It was not as though the other students of color favored by affirmative action were not qualified. It's basically saying that if a non-AAPI POC gets the same stats and qualifications and application as an AAPI, they actually are more qualified to get into that college because they faced more hurdles to get there in the first place. Thirdly, the case grouped every AAPI together, perpetuating the model minority myth and stating that they were all the same. I mean, think about it. A bunch of Asians are mobilized to fight education bias, which is playing straight into the model minority trap. In reality, not every Asian is a good student. And in terms of groupings, there are hundreds of cultures within the Asian American identity, all of whom face different struggles from one another. Finally, affirmative action is still needed today, and I'll talk about this on the next slide. So here's a few reasons why we still need affirmative action. First, POC are underrepresented in colleges still. There are disparities between Black and Latinx student populations and their admissions to colleges. Banning affirmative action is estimated to decrease the likelihood for these students to be admitted into college by 23%. And we know diversity is good because we see substantial evidence supporting that diverse classrooms increase self-confidence, leadership, and reduces bias. Secondly, affirmative action allows kids that would not have otherwise been admitted to college to succeed by providing them with opportunity. This dismantles some amount of structural violence, which is basically on the premise that if you can keep the poor, then they'll never be able to become rich. And it at least enables them to fight it, since academic excellence is correlated with income rather than intelligence, which is why we see that Asian Americans have high rates of academic excellence, whereas other races who have on average a lower income because of these things have lower academic excellence. Third, banning affirmative action is only good for white supremacy. Asian Americans still face the highest rates of job discrimination when it comes to promotions. Banning affirmative action in schools sets a precedent to ban it in jobs too. Additionally, banning affirmative action helps white people get into college, but also the job market, which crowds out minorities and cements income inequality. Finally, AAPI are not only Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, which is the ones we hear about the most often, but also every other ethnicity in all of Asia. Some ethnicities face higher rates of bias than others, and affirmative action helps even this disparity. And as a result, we believe that affirmative action is still extremely important.
So now we're going to talk about why you might have noticed in this presentation that there weren't any cases that happened in the 21st century. Now, I just want to clarify before I start talking about this, there are many cases involving AAPI in the United States at the state level or at the district level, but I'm talking about Supreme Court cases, which are at the federal level. So when we were putting this presentation together, we were researching all kinds of different court cases and putting things together and figuring out which ones we wanted to include in this presentation, and we were struggling to find Supreme Court cases. We basically were left with two options. Either one, we would try to find cases at the state level or try to find other Supreme Court cases and add them in there, or two, turn it into a learning opportunity. And that is what we ended up deciding to do today. So, as I told you earlier, the Supreme Court hears less than 200 cases a year, and they divide up that number of cases to fit certain categories. So, a certain percentage of those cases revolve around social issues dealing with people of color. Usually, and especially in the last 10 to 20 years, those cases have been given preference to Black Americans. Now, there's a valid reason for this. Black Americans have faced lots of discrimination and oppression in America, and these cases are helping them make strides and have progress in America. However, there is a myth that is commonly perpetuated that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders don't face hate, racism, oppression, discrimination, or anything else. And that's simply not true. Society has a very limited definition of race, and people of color are not just Black Americans. It's a very diverse group of people. And we wanted to take some time to kind of talk about this, especially with the recent increase in hate crimes towards Asian Americans that's been happening since the coronavirus in 2020, which Garrett touched on. But it didn't begin there. This has gone on since the beginning of the United States. So if you wanted to do your own research, there are plenty of cases involving Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders at the local level. However, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has not given them priority when choosing to hear their cases.
The legacy of all of these cases can be tied together with the theme that movement towards progress comes with its consequences, and that it is a long process, as seen by many of these cases being overturned decades later. As we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, for every 2 steps of progress made for the rights of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, 1 step is taken backwards.
Great. All right. Thank you for coming to our presentation. Here's all the sources we used. The presentation is linked in the chat for those who are curious. This is a good starting point. And yeah, thanks for coming. We're going to open it up for questions in a second. But first, I just make sure to stick around through our Q&A session. There's another group going after us in like a few minutes after our questions are over. And then our Instagram is ECAAR which is, we post informational slideshows there so that you guys can educate yourselves more. We have a website, the AsianAmericanStory.org. And yeah, don't forget the Vietnam War group is next, and they're gonna have a super interesting presentation. And yeah, thank you for coming. We are opening it up for questions now.
So some people are asking already about a recording for this webinar. And so, yes, this is being recorded.
And part one is on the, it's on YouTube. It's also on our website. It should be linked there. I'll double check that, but yeah.
If you signed up to attend this, you will automatically get a recording of this presentation. And if you'd like one of the first session, please put your email in the chat to panelists. Thank you.
A couple of awesome job, everybody. And some excellent jobs and excellent work. Well, thank you.
Oh, I see a question in the Q&A. Someone has asked, what role do you think the recent interest in Asian culture plays in racism in America? And they gave an example, I assume for Asian culture, of K-pop and manga and etc. I don't know, does one of you guys want to answer that question, or do you want me to try to answer it?
I can answer it. So
Okay.
I think that I think there's a fine line between interest and just kind of straight up stereotyping. I know a lot of people who think that all Asian culture is just manga and anime, as you said. But there's also people who genuinely appreciate the context of manga and anime, and they genuinely appreciate the art. And I think it depends. If you are willing to understand the cultural value behind each of those things, and you're able to explain that, and you're able to understand that, I think that the racism isn't like a big deal. But I also see a lot of people who, or not racism, but like the appreciation of it isn't a big deal. But I also see people who only focus on those things, and they have a very one-dimensional view of what Asian culture is. And they think that all Asian culture can be summed up in manga and anime, which it can't. And so I think that's where we get to the problems of racism regarding more recent interest in the topics of Chinese and Japanese culture. So yeah.
I would also say that there's been a lot of people who want to appreciate the good parts, like manga and anime, but they aren't particularly inclined to speak up against hate when they see it and to fight for more equal rights.
Yeah, just to kind of elaborate on what Anna just said, I think cultural appropriation is kind of what came to my mind when I read that question. It is a common thing with a lot of minority communities. People want the culture, but they don't want the oppression. And Garrett kind of touched on this. They have a very limited idea of that race, and in context for this question, Asian Americans. And I think it's great to appreciate a certain culture, but like Garrett said, it's not just that. This is part of Asian American history, this presentation, and this is not trendy or anything like that. It's not maybe as interesting to people, but it's equally important. And I think that it's great that people are interested in Asian American culture, but it's important to not just do things that are trendy, or not just do things without thinking about them. But we have another question that says, what are your thoughts regarding reparations for any particular group of people that have been discriminated against? Well, I actually do have a thought on this before. I'm sure you guys are going to want to answer that question. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but to try to sum it up very quickly, I think that a lot of people look at it as this group of people wants to take something away from someone else. And I think that's a very closed-minded way of thinking about it. I think a better way of thinking about it is that that group of people that's been oppressed wants equal treatment. They don't want to take anything away from people. They want other people to stop taking things away from them. And I think it's reparations, not revenge, and people need to remember that. And, you know, Garrett really did a good job of touching on this in affirmative action, and I think that might be where this question is coming from. But, you know, I think it's great because if we are able to give reparations to people that have been discriminated against, we can have a more equal society where a more diverse group of people can participate, and I think that would be better. But that's just my thought on it.
So there's a question in the chat. Does there have to be a new case for the Supreme Court to overturn old cases?
Okay. I'm gonna try to answer this question without going on like my whole legal spiel. As you can probably tell, I love talking about the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court basically works with what's called a stare decisis, which is basically the case that they use to decide the new case. It's the precedent. So they're like, based on what happened with this, we're gonna make a decision on this case. That does not mean that in order for a case to be heard, that there has to have been a case about it before. The Supreme Court can hear anything that they want to hear. Anyone who's able to get to the Supreme Court, they will hear your case. So that is encouraging in a way, because that means that some of these cases that will get equality for certain groups of people can be heard by the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court doesn't need to hear a case of the specific topic for it to be decided. But if there are cases that are about a similar topic, they will use it to decide the case. And they will either uphold that same ruling or they'll overturn it.
So related.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
A related question is, did studying these Supreme Court cases inspire you to pursue constitutional law? And that might be for Jada too.
Well, to give Jada a little bit of a break, I guess, I would say personally, I don't think I would go into constitutional law as like a career path. I'm not looking to law as my career path, but I do think it would be super interesting to take college courses on constitutional law and take college courses on history, Asian American and Black history and all of that, just to educate myself further, because I definitely know it's not super well explained in school. So yeah.
Similar to what Garrett said, it was really interesting to research this presentation, but some of the stuff went super far over my head, and it's definitely one of the more challenging subjects, but it's something I would study further, but not as a career.
To answer that question, I want to be a lawyer. I want to major in constitutional law. This presentation wasn't what made me want to go into that. I've always thought that constitutional law in the Supreme Court was interesting because I think protests are great, but a lot of the major changes that have happened in our society have come through the Supreme Court, and it's a long and arduous process, but a lot of change comes out of it. And the thing that I liked about this presentation is I had never heard of any of these cases before we started our research, but I was able to see how much it's changed the lives of the millions of Asian Americans that live in the United States, and I found that to be really inspiring.
Does anybody else have anything to say on any of the questions?
I'm seeing a question, a couple new questions in the chat, but we'll just go in chronological order. The first one is, although laws have been created against racism, it still exists, and our thoughts on that. I know personally, like, I don't think that structurally we have gone far enough. I think that laws are great, but I don't think that people have really, or that legally minorities have enough representation, because in order for us to have a truly equitable and like equal society, you need to have a certain extent of like us, the law, making up for the fact that society inherently will always be a little bit racist. And I don't think that that laws have really gone far enough. We know that it's possible to overturn these laws. We know that a lot of times they're misinterpreted, as we talked a lot today about, by the Supreme Court, and that structurally there's always a lot of losses to be had. So that's just my thoughts on it. I don't know if somebody else wants to speak to that too.
Yeah, Garrett, I agree with you. I think to kind of respond to this question about the judicial branch being more proactive, I think that we kind of touched on this in our presentation. The Supreme Court has tried through different amendments in cases to sort of like handle racism and make things better, but as you can see, people that are determined to be racist just find more clever ways of doing it. And it seems like no matter how many amendments are passed, like Garrett said, it's always going to be present because you can change laws, but you can't really change people's minds and biases. But I do think that the Supreme Court should be more proactive. There's all these legal terms about like the mindsets of justices, and some of them kind of believe that it's the Supreme Court's job to hear these cases before it happens and kind of be proactive, and other justices believe that that's not the place of the Supreme Court. They don't make laws, they don't enforce laws, they just see the Constitution, and it's kind of an ongoing thing. But I personally think that the Supreme Court should try to be more proactive because, as kind of said in this question, you know, how many people have to be hurt before the case is finally decided? Because as you could see, some of these cases took years. But that's just my personal belief.
So there's a very long chat question. Many of the Supreme Court cases discussed today were responses to some hurt inflicted on an individual as a result of racism already present in society, which makes racial reparations through the judicial branch a reactive process. Is there a precedent for the judicial branch being proactive in addressing and mitigating racism, racial issues before an incident occurs, or is that more the role of the executive, legislative branches of government?
I think Jada answered that question a little bit, but I can go a little bit further. I think personally, the judicial branch, personally, I think the judicial branch's responsibility is just to interpret the Constitution. So if there's no standing precedent to talk about how something shouldn't be racist, which now there is, but there wasn't previously, I don't think that's the justice's role. But I do think that the main role of the judicial branch is to review laws and see if they're constitutional. So if it's within the Constitution to say for these reasons, this shouldn't be a thing because it's racist or because it's unconstitutional, then I think that that's where the judicial branch can step in, and that might proactively prevent some amount of racism. But also, I think that it's primarily the job of the legislature and the executive branches to create and enforce laws that are not structurally discriminating against a certain race.
One question in the Q&A feature: have any of you had any hatred and ignorance directed towards you because of COVID? Answer only if you're comfortable. Just wondering about this area where I live. I can't speak on any experiences of racism, so Garrett, Jada, go for it.
I know this isn't really, okay, so I'll after I answer, I'll hand it off to May and Olivia if you guys want to talk about this a little bit too. But essentially, when COVID first started, I went to another country because we thought it was safer there, and it was, and then we ended up coming back after a few weeks. But so I missed a lot of the brunt of that at the very start. However, there have been instances where people like cross the street when they see me, and like you can never know, right? Like whether that's a racially motivated thing or if that's just like they want to be safe. But I do notice that like a lot of people cross the street when they see me, whereas they don't when they see other people. So yeah, I don't know what the deal with that is. Maybe it's just because I'm wearing a mask and some people don't, but yeah. And then I think it's also harder to gauge because I haven't personally gone out very much. I generally stay inside, which means that I'm not exposed to that kind of environment so much. But I do know that there has been a spike in Asian American hatred. And I also know that like that even before quarantine, I would get a lot of stereotypical comments about like, oh yeah, do you eat dogs and stuff like that, that were quite hurtful, but that's just kind of the reality of it. So yeah.
Well, I'm lucky enough to be a person that hasn't experienced a lot of targeted racism even during COVID-19, but I do have a lot of family friends that I know have gotten negative comments just by walking, like with things simple enough as like walking down the street and people rolling down their car windows to say racial slurs at them. And it's just sad to realize that even though I personally haven't had a lot of negative experiences, that there's definitely been a lot, um, even in our community. So that's just what I have to say.
So this is not, I haven't faced discrimination on the basis of like people looking at my appearance in regards to COVID because I'm not Asian American. However, this may seem a little odd, but for me, wearing a mask all of the time, obviously when I go places, has caused me to have a lot of negative experiences racially because there's a stereotype that black people are aggressive and that they're threatening. And, I was always taught to smile at people whenever I could so that, I look less threatening. And I've been accused of shoplifting a bunch of times. And, when I'm wearing a mask, you can't see my facial expressions. And I've had people like back away from me in the store and been followed around. And I don't always know exactly why that is. But ever since I started wearing a mask, places, it happened a lot more. And especially with like my dad and my cousins who are male wearing masks places and like masks that are like bandanas and people associating that with like an appearance that's been threatening, and it's just kind of problematic because you have to wear a mask but people take that as us appearing to be threatening to people. But I haven't had like rude comment in the way that like my peers who are Asian American have had because of COVID.
Yeah, and I think that's the last question, but I'll just give like one more kind of anecdote. One of my friends was at Target in Issaquah, I believe, and she and her like 12-year-old sister were just like in the store shopping because they needed stuff. And they're Korean, not Chinese, and somebody went up to them, like a white guy went up to them, pulled his mask down and like spat at them before running away. And it was really bad. Like she called me and she was like, oh my gosh, Garrett, where do I report a hate incident? Because by the way, if you see a hate incident against an Asian American, go to stopaapihate.org and report it. It really helps us. Anyway, and yeah, it was just a very sad story, but yeah. And then if there's no more comments, I want to keep this moving, so I'll hand it off to the Vietnam War group.
All right, and if anyone has additional questions that are directed towards the Supreme Court cases group in the future, just put them in the Q&A and the presenters will be able to type a response to you guys during our presentation. So just keep that in mind if any questions come up. But otherwise, I think I can share my screen for our next presentation. All right.
Okay, so thank you to the Systemic Pursuit Group for their presentation. Our next topic is going to be a brief history of the Vietnam War, including the biases in our history textbooks, the effect that the war had, and a personal account from a South Vietnamese veteran. Before we begin, we would also like to acknowledge that everyone living in the Seattle area is currently living on Duwamish land, and if you live outside of the Seattle area, you also probably live on the land of other various indigenous peoples, as you can see on this map.
We also want to be completely transparent about the ethnic groups that we're going to be mentioning in our presentation. We're mainly going to be focusing on the North and South Vietnamese people, but our personal account is going to be from a Vietnamese American, and we also are going to be talking a lot about Americans because of their involvement in the Vietnam War. We also have brief mentions of the indigenous people of Vietnam, who are called the Montagnards, and in the history of the war, we're going to be mentioning the French, Cambodians, Laotians, and Koreans. We also want to disclaim that we focus mostly on the Vietnamese perspective of the war, and we're not trying to belittle the American experiences in the war, but rather we're just trying to bring to light a less taught perspective of this war.
Okay, so today we will be covering what our textbooks say about the war, a personal account, and what happened post-war.
We're also curious about what you already know about this topic, so if you're comfortable, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. You can type anything in from what you know about the war to any connections to the war or people involved in the war. And while you guys are typing that into the chat, we can go around and say what we knew before we started researching this. So before I started researching this, I knew that the Vietnam War happened, but I didn't know any of the specifics, and I wasn't taught it in any of my history classes. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to learn more about it and research it.
Yeah, same with me. I am a person who is fortunate enough to say that I have been to many different schools around the world, and none of the schools that I've been to have ever talked about the Vietnam War. So it was definitely really eye-opening to have this opportunity to research it.
Yeah, and I am personally a Vietnamese American, so I've definitely heard stories from my parents as well as my grandparents, but I've never actually learned anything in school. I just know the basics of the war.
Yeah, so it looks like some people have put their thoughts in the chat. So we have the US government lied to the American people about the war. The American perspective revolves around stopping the spread of communism. Some of my relatives were able to escape at the fall of Saigon. My parents left beforehand. So those are all really good. And there's a question in the chat. Can you please share a link to this presentation as well? We will be sharing a link to this presentation at the end. So stick around and we'll put the link in the chat. All right, so it looks like everyone, or at least some people, have a little bit of background knowledge on the war, and that's great. But for those who don't know, I'll be talking a little bit about how the Vietnam War started, and then I am going to be talking about how well this information has been presented in my world history textbook. And just a trigger warning, we are going to be discussing war. All right, so we are starting in the late 1800s, specifically 1887, and this is when the French colonized all of mainland Southeast Asia. And at this time, this colonized territory, which is circled in red on the slide, was known as French Indochina. But now we know this area as the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So for about half a century, Indochina, which was again Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, remained under the French rule, but eventually Indochina wanted independence from the French, so they fought against them. And in an effort to claim their independence, this fighting became a war, and this war became known as the First Indochina War. And within the leaders of French Indochina was a Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. And he is best known for, in January of 1954, which is nearly 10 years after the start of the war, for leading a siege against the French garrison in the city of Dien Bien Phu. And this siege is extremely famous because it not only drove the French out of Vietnam, but it also ended this First Indochina War. So Ho Chi Minh was kind of seen as a quote-unquote hero in his community. So after the end of the First Indochina War, the area of Vietnam was split into two parts. So there was North Vietnam, which was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was led by Ho Chi Minh. And then there was South Vietnam, who was ruled by a president named Ngo Dinh Diem. And so those are the two sides. And also around the time that the First Indochina War ended, the Korean War also came to an end. So a lot of countries and groups around Asia were facing dramatic change. So in an effort to kind of resolve a lot of the issues that were happening, 16 nations around the world, including the United States, Laos, Cambodia, North and South Vietnam, all agreed to get together and discuss some of these changes that were happening. And this meeting was called the Geneva Conference. And this conference produced what was called the Geneva Accords. And the sections that we're going to be focusing on are the sections that discussed the future of Vietnam. So the main topic discussed about Vietnam in the Accords was the question of whether or not to unite North and South Vietnam or keep them separate. And there were many advocating for both sides, but the final agreement was for Vietnam to continue their North-South division for a period of 2 years. And after these 2 years, the Accords wrote that there would be an election to determine the permanent political system and government of a united Vietnam. So no more North-South, just one Vietnam. And it's important to note that although this agreement was on the Accords, South Vietnam was one of the nations present that decided not to sign the Accords. And because of this, they weren't obligated to do what the Accords said. So 2 years passed and it came time to hold this election. And it's important to note that during the 2-year gap between the Accords and this election, North and South Vietnam had been operating extremely different governments. So in North Vietnam, there was Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist leader, but in South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem served as a president. So this election started as planned and all the Vietnamese people were casting their ballots, but as the election progressed and the results became clear in favor of Ho Chi Minh in Northern Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem and the Southern Vietnamese government decided to cancel this election. And Southern Vietnam was allowed to do this despite the election being written in the Geneva Accords, because as I said earlier, they didn't sign the Geneva Accords, so they were able to cancel this election.
And as a result of this election being canceled, Vietnam no longer had a determined future. This led the divide of Vietnam to continue, and both sides were very unstable, both politically and economically. While Southern Vietnam had a weak economy that largely depended on their ally, the United States, North Vietnam took every opportunity to seize control of Vietnam in both the North and South. So essentially, Ho Chi Minh's forces in the North continued to fight to take over Southern Vietnam through brute force, because, as we mentioned before, he wanted a united Vietnam. South Vietnam, as a result, pushed back to try and prevent this from happening. And over time, these forces became more and more aggressive, which eventually created the 20-year period of what was called the Vietnam War. And May's personal account is going to share stories from the war in a little bit.
All right, so now I want to look and compare information from what we just said to an American World History textbook, and the photo on the screen is my world history textbook that I use for my modern world history course at Mercer Island High School. And just a note, I haven't learned about the Vietnam War in school, but I know that my school covers it in 11th grade, but I have heard from people who've taken the course that the teaching is very American biased, and we'll be able to see that when we look at what's in the textbook here. So here is chapter 7, section 4, which is where the textbook talks about the Vietnam War, and the section is called War in Southeast Asia. And for those who can see, there's sections on French Indochina, and here it talks about Ho Chi Minh and the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and then it talks about the actual war under the heading America Enters the War. And then there's a total of 2.5 pages front and back, but we'll start on the first 3 pages. So the first thing I want to note about these pages is that, as I said, there's only 2.5 pages in a 900-page world history textbook, and that's not even a full section of a chapter. Like, these 5 pages aren't this whole section. There's like a couple more that don't talk about the Vietnam War. And the second thing is that if you follow along the reading, you can also see a lot of implicit American bias within the text. So for example, here on the top right, for those who can't see, it's a section titled The Vietnam War, but the first sentence of this section is the Vietnam War thrust American soldiers into an alien and dangerous environment of jungles and swamps. And while this sentence isn't by any means, inaccurate, the fact that it's the first sentence under the heading of the Vietnam War comes to imply that the Vietnam War was an event that was solely difficult for American soldiers, while in reality, every soldier, whether that be American, Vietnamese, or any other nationality, had to deal with the quote-unquote dangerous environments of jungles and swamps. And here are the next 2 pages, and there are similar biases that can be seen throughout. So for example, the first paragraph here on the left states that during the Vietnam era, young American men were required to register for the military draft, and it proceeds to talk about what life was like for American soldiers during the war. But we never see a counter paragraph as to what life was like as a Vietnamese soldier or a soldier of any other nationality. And especially under the heading, The Vietnam War Ends here, it completely focuses on what was going on in America as opposed to focusing on what was going on in Vietnam. So just to show you guys this, I'll read you guys a section from the second paragraph. So it states, more Americans opposed the war. As the war continued, the nation became deeply and bitterly divided over the ongoing struggle. Many Americans of all ages continued to support the war effort in Vietnam. Others wanted to end the loss of lives. More and more young people turned out for massive street demonstration, all part of a growing anti-war movement. It was clear that an increasing number of Americans wanted no more body bags coming back or television footage of burned Vietnamese villages. At the same time, many agreed with a housewife who said, "I want to get out, but I don't want to give up." And as you can see, this paragraph completely talks about the American citizen's perspective. And of this section, the only part that really talks about Vietnamese perspective is the last section, where it talks about how North Vietnam won the war. So by pointing out all of these biases, I want to just acknowledge that part of studying history is reading about both sides of a conflict, and it's often hard to talk about either side without sounding biased. And also, I want to acknowledge that there were a lot of American struggles during the war. Like, these struggles are completely legitimate, and these problems shouldn't be belittled. But what I'm trying to say by pointing out all of these biases is not that we should be removing American struggles, but that we should be adding the Vietnamese perspective. So like the triumphs, the hardships of the Vietnamese people as well. So the next few slides are a few examples of things that we thought that textbooks could include, or just classes in general could include, to be a little bit more inclusive about the different perspectives on the Vietnam War.
So the first item we have is Vietnamese Independence Day. Everyone knows that July 4th is a huge holiday that we celebrate here in America. So it's worth mentioning that the victory of Ho Chi Minh siege at Dien Bien Phu actually is what Vietnamese celebrate as their Independence Day. And just as a warning, the next slide contains violence and rape. Another thing that we thought should be incorporated into our textbooks is the indigenous people of Vietnam called the Montagnards. They are almost never mentioned in our education about the war, but the fact is that there's a huge impact on them during the 20 years of the war. An example would be the My Lai massacre, where American soldiers slaughtered anywhere from 400 to 570 unarmed civilians in the Quang Ngai province, none of which were actually near enlistment age. The elderly, women, and children were all killed, and girls and women were also raped before they were killed. And this is absolutely horrible that these people are not even mentioned in our education. And it really comes to show the importance of having a textbook that talks about all perspectives in a war. And so this is very important, and we want to show everyone about this side of the Vietnamese people. And another thing that could balance out our biases of the textbook would be a study of accounts from Vietnamese citizens. So that's what we're going to be doing right now. From a personal account of my grandfather, he is a Vietnamese American veteran from South Vietnam. So he was on the South Vietnam side that lost the war. I was able to interview him and translate our interview in this video that talks about his experience in the war. And also, just to clarify, during the interview, he asked me if I could hear him in the interview just to make sure that everyone knows what he said. So Olivia will play the video.
Oh, and just for some people who might be on smaller devices, this video does have subtitles, and that's the only English. So just for the people who are on bigger screens, you might need to look a little closely on your devices.
Khi đó là coi như quản trị thất thủ đó. Con nghe được không?
Yeah, nghe được.
Quản trị mất thì Việt Cộng nó phá kích vào thành phố Quảng Trị ấy. Ông nội hồi đó là sĩ quan của cái chế độ miền Nam. Thành ra ông nội phải bỏ chạy. Thì khi đó là coi như là cái tỉnh nó bị mất. Tư lệnh vùng 3, tư lệnh sư đoàn 3 với là tỉnh trưởng bỏ cái vùng Quảng Trị chạy vào Huế. Thì ba là sĩ quan, ba cũng phải di tản theo đó. Ông nội cũng phải di tản theo. Nhưng mà khi mà đi qua cái cầu dài của cái Quảng Trị và Thừa Thiên thì bị Việt Cộng nó chặn lại, nó pháo kích. Và thì lực lượng Việt Nam không có vượt qua được cái cầu dài đó. Ngay cái kỵ binh, tức là cái M172, M172 là kiệt giáp của cái quân lực Việt Nam Cộng Hòa cũng vượt qua cái cầu đó. Và ông trung tá cái liên đoàn trưởng là ông bị thương. Thì cuối cùng phải đi bọc về cái đường ruộng xuống Khe Sanh, tức là cuốn Khe Sanh để bọc vô Mỹ Chánh. Thế mới là vượt thoát được. Thì ông nội hồi đó là cũng là chạy thôi. Thì coi như là vũ khí đã vất hết. Là chỉ có mặc một cái quần là đội cái nón sắt, giày dép và chụp hết và lồi xuống như chụp cái đồng ruộng đó đó. Thì trong kia trong làng ta là Việt Cộng nó phục kích, nó bắn ra. Thì nhưng mà cũng xa quá. Thành ra chỉ có mình còn nước chạy thôi. Thì khi mà chạy mệt quá là ông nội nhớ là coi như là khát nước, thì cái nước ruộng đó, mà cái nước mà cái đó là mùa hè rồi, thành nó coi như mưa rồi cũng có, chỉ còn nắng không à. Thế là khát nước quá là ông nội chỉ cúi xuống mà uống cái nước mà coi như trong ruộng đó, mà mấy cái vùng nhỏ nhỏ mà trâu nó đi, cái nước nó còn lại đó, uống cho đỡ khát. Thì chạy ra được Mỹ Chánh. Xong bữa đó thì quân đội thì có một chiến của cái quân đội miền Nam đó, cái đầm miền Bắc của ông nội vô lại Huế. Thì đó là cái câu chuyện mà ông nội nhớ nhất trong cái thời kỳ mà tham gia cuộc chiến. Ông nội đi động viên từ 68, mà 72 là coi như thất thủ, thì ông nội chạy từ Quảng Trị và tới Huế. Đó là câu chuyện nhớ nhất tâm đời của ông nội đó.
And so as a summary, if anyone couldn't read the subtitles, my grandfather was retreating back to Hue as the North was invading their province. So what happened after the war? As everyone knows, the South lost the war, and so Southern soldiers were put into re-education camp. And it was basically prison, but re-education camp was a nicer term for it. This is what their daily schedule might have looked like. From 7 to 12, they worked on farm fields or built houses to rebuild Vietnam. 12 to 1, they had a break for lunch. 1 to 5 was back to work. 5 to 7 was a dinner break. And 7 to 9, they were forced to learn about communism. My grandpa was fortunate to only stay there for 3 years, but others had to stay for more than 10 years, and many died in these camps from starvation, illnesses, hard labor, and abuse. In those 3 years, my grandmother was able to visit my grandfather and supply him with food, medication, clothes, books, and cash. One of the books he received was about traditional medicine using herbs to treat illnesses. In the beginning, soldiers went along with him into the forest to collect these herbs since he knew about medicine. And after gaining trust, he was allowed to go by himself. So in mid-1978 at 5 a.m., he left to go gather herbs and took that chance to escape and take a bus to his hometown, Hue, as you can see on the map in the middle of Vietnam. He stayed in Hue for one night, then left to Can Tho, where he, at the very south of Vietnam, and then later went to Gamo at the very tip of Vietnam. A little later, his wife and 3 children joined him in Gamo, and he stayed there for 10 years, doing a lot of various jobs, but always in fear of getting caught by the government. So he took a chance. After a few trials and error, he was able to catch a boat to escape to Thailand in 1989. And from there, he traveled to the US. And this was quite common for many Vietnamese refugees after the war. About 125,000 Vietnamese arrived in the United States in 1975 as a result of a US-sponsored evacuation program following the end of the Vietnam War, and that is where he lives today.
And so moving on to post-war effects, one of the worst effects was the amount of casualties. So there were around 3,358,000 deaths from the war, and this includes 2 million Vietnamese civilians, 1.1 million North Vietnamese troops, 200,000 South Vietnamese troops, and around 58,000 US troops. The war also affected many soldiers and refugees mentally, leaving them with depression or post-traumatic stress disorders. And moving on to the economic effects, the US economy suffered greatly after spending around $120 billion on the war, leading to inflation, and this was also made worse by the worldwide oil crisis that was happening at the time, that made fuel prices skyrocket. Vietnam also suffered from the oil crisis in 1968, but they put a broad free market policy in place, meaning that companies could sell goods at the highest price that consumers were willing to pay. This policy helped boost oil export revenues. Another economic effect from the war was that diplomatic relations with the United States stopped and didn't resume until the 1990s. And one last effect was that the vegetation on the South Vietnamese countryside was destroyed. So the US military used more than 14 million tons of explosives during the war, which mostly affected the Vietnamese countryside. They also sprayed the countryside with millions of gallons of chemicals called Agent Orange to kill the vegetation, as you can see in the image above. And this affected Vietnam greatly because before the war, they were a major rice exporter, but due to Agent Orange killing most of their crops, they were unable to even feed their own population. The chemicals also caused widespread health problems for many generations, including our own, such as birth defects. And moving on to the political effects of the war. So in the US, even during the war, the country was split because a lot of Americans were opposed to the war and the US's role in it. And the Democratic Party was split after the war because the war alienated many blue-collar Democrats who later broke off of the Democratic Party to join the Republican or Independent Party. The Democratic Party was also weakened by urban riots and inflation that was caused by the war. And it also undermined liberal reform and made civilians even more suspicious of the government and Richard Nixon, who was the Republican president after the war. And in Vietnam, even after the North won, occasional violent conflicts broke out between Vietnam and China and Cambodia for about 15 years. And in 1976, even though there was still some internal conflict and distrust between the former North and South, Vietnam reunified with a new national constitution as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
Thank you, Priya. And so that wraps up our presentation. Here are all the links to where we found our research from. And if you're interested in doing your own research, this could be a good starting point for you. So we already linked our slides in the chat, and you guys can review our information and slides as well.
Thank you everyone for coming to our presentation. We would also like to thank our sponsors, Share Tea, a bubble tea shop in ECAAR, and KCLS for hosting us. And if you're interested in hearing more about our organization, our next seminar is going to be in 2 weeks, Wednesday, March 17th at 7 p.m. And they are going to be talking about Asian targeted racism and current events and hate towards Asian Americans. So you can sign up for those presentations by going to the link in the slide on the slide in bold, the asianamericanstory.weebly.com. And we also have an Instagram account where we frequently post educational infographics about Asian American representation. It's ECAAR-MI. And if you have any additional questions about our presentations or how to sign up for any of our seminars, feel free to ask now or contact us through our Instagram or our email, ecaarmihs@gmail.com. Thank you.
All right, so that wraps up our presentation. And now we want to open up the floor for any questions that people may have. Okay, so I'm already seeing a few. All right, so the first question is, how are Vietnamese American citizens treated during America's involvement in the Vietnam War? And I might need to let Priya or May talk about this because they know more about, the effects of the war, but I actually don't think that there were that many Vietnamese American citizens at all during the war, because as May said, the majority of Vietnamese American immigration actually happened after the war. And May, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yes. Oh, that is.
Yeah, I can go.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's many Vietnamese Americans during that time, but if they were, I know that there was a lot of hate towards the war, so I would assume they received a bit of hate.
Yeah, I just want to confirm Olivia's statement that yes, there weren't, most of the immigration, the refugees came right after the war, and there weren't many Vietnamese Americans in America during the war. They mostly came after due to the violent conflicts with China and Cambodia and the internal conflicts.
All right, we'll leave a few minutes for anyone else that might have questions.
Briefly, I do want to say that during the Vietnam War, I know kind of similar to COVID-19, like the Asian Americans that had already immigrated to the US did face a certain level of heightened racism at the time. And people would assume that everyone who was of East Asian descent or South Asian descent would be like are Vietnamese, and they would receive hate in America for that, even though like there were very few actual Vietnamese immigrants.
Okay, so I see a few more questions. Is there any work being done to actually get more of the Vietnamese perspective added to textbooks? Well, at least from my perspective, I'm gonna have to say no. But I know that the Vietnam War is obviously something that ECAAR has been researching for the past few months, and we hope that in the future, like I know there's already a section on the Vietnam War in 11th grade history. So I think that if we were able to work with the social studies department, we could potentially try to expand that unit. But so far, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know of any work that's being done to add Vietnamese perspective into textbooks. Yeah, okay. Our next question is there a lesson from the Vietnam War that we should be taking now? And May and Priya, would you guys like to take this question? Either of you?
I am I'm not really sure right now. I haven't thought a lot about that. But May, do you want to answer? I can think about it.
I would say please educate yourself. Our schools don't teach us this. As you can see in our textbook, it was American biased, and we should really be doing more to learn more. I know there's probably documentaries out there with like Vietnamese veterans probably talking, and you guys can definitely go check this out and learn more. And also, the Vietnamese War is not the only Asian war out there. There's tons of more wars, and we just chose to do the Vietnamese War. And it's also really important to learn about those wars too, because there's definitely effects on Americans as well as Asian Americans.
So we have a question. What inspired you to look at the Vietnamese perspective on this war?
Well, we decided to look at the Vietnamese side of this because, as Olivia said, in our textbooks and most of what we're taught in our classes at school mostly focus on the American side of all world events, and we need to educate ourselves about all sides of every event. So yeah.
I also, in the beginning of this school year, had a conversation with several 11th graders who had taken our 11th grade social studies course, and they were very strongly opinionated about how they only learned about American accounts in their history classes. So that kind of motivated me to start researching about the Vietnamese perspective as well. I don't know about May.
Well, at the beginning of the year, we really wanted to do a bunch of Asian wars, but we chose to focus on the Vietnamese War, mostly because I had a relative who was in the war, so we were able to present his perspective and a personal account in this presentation. So it really allowed like an eye-opening experience to have a personal veteran. And we will definitely wanted to do many wars as possible, but we just chose to do this war, and especially because of my grandpa.
Priya, I'll let you take this next question. So what lasting impacts does the war have on Vietnam's social state?
So Vietnam, well, I also talked about how the chemicals in a lot of the crops still affect today's generation with birth defects, and their crops are still regrowing and not completely reestablished, and that has a big effect. But I haven't actually researched a lot of how they're still affected today socially. So I will have to research that, and if you do still have that question, feel free to email us and I can definitely get back to you on that.
Okay, so we have, it looks like one more question that's kind of similar to the last question. So how/why did you become interested in focusing on this particular topic? And as I said, like, I hate when we learn about like any topic in school and we only focus on one perspective, because I feel like in any situation, whether that be a war or not, there's more than one point of view and all of them should be recognized, especially when it comes to history, because things can be often presented very biased and in the wrong way if you don't look at everyone's perspective. So I just noticed in the beginning of the year that the Vietnam War was a topic that one, um, we had opportunities to have personal accounts with, like May said, and two, it's also a topic that we often don't learn about and is very um, biased when taught about in our school system. So it made me like really motivated to research. And also the fact that I had rarely even studied the Vietnam War before also got me interested in studying this topic.
Yeah, I think Olivia pretty much covered that. That was our motivation behind choosing the Vietnam War.
I just wanted to also add that history bias is not just shown in American school education, but I know personally from my father, he was in Vietnam learning his education, and after the war, he learned about the Vietnam War, and it was very biased towards the North Vietnam, and they just learned that South Vietnam and Americans were bad. Yeah, so obviously not just here, but everywhere else. So it's very important that we should educate about both sides of any topic.
And I think that also this question goes to the core of ECAAR. Like when we were starting this kind of club, we were thinking of like originally it was like focused around the fact that Asian American stories aren't told, but the more we kind of researched it and stuff, we realized that like the Asian American stories that are told, like for instance, the Vietnam War, are very biased and skewed Eurocentrically. Like we see history in the United States from a point of view of everyone who lives in Europe/America and like Americentric history. And to a certain extent, that's a good thing. We need to learn like American history, but also it's like a white perspective and it kind of excludes a lot of the other side of the story. So I think Vietnam is one of those things that when we were looking at various topics, it kind of stood out as a prime example of that fact and very much the core of what ECAAR is trying to fight.
Just to kind of add on to what Garrett was saying, one of the reasons why I wanted to join ECAAR, it was actually one of my co-presenters, Anna, who was like, you should join this club, like we're doing some really great things. Because I'm taking world history this year. And I literally asked my teacher because we'd gone through like 350 years of history and we still hadn't left Europe. And I was like, why have we not touched another country? And she was just like, well, all the important stuff was happening in Europe. So, that's what we have to learn about. And I was like, how could it be that there's multiple other continents with millions of people? They were just sitting there waiting for Europe to discover everything. They were just like, oh, we'll just sit here, we'll wait for Europe to do it. I was like, that's stupid. But, specifically to the Vietnam War, I didn't know anything about it. I literally knew nothing. All that I knew was the very basic effects that it had on America. And that doesn't make any sense because a war is two-sided, assuming that, like if it's just like both sides didn't do anything, which is not even true, you know, I just learned about the effect that it had on American soldiers, and I've heard the term napalm skies, and I didn't know what that meant. Turns out that was like a gas that was invented and dropped on Vietnamese children. It could like burn people alive. They don't mention that. they're just like, ah, napalm, yeah, whatever, it wasn't that bad. And that's awful. And so I think the Vietnam War and the Supreme Court cases are just things that aren't really talked about. People think that they're not important. And that was why I wanted to be part of this presentation, because I felt like this was an opportunity to spread more awareness and, like Olivia said, give both sides of the story.
All right, so it looks like there's a few more questions. The next one is, did you know a lot of this information prior to researching, or was this an educational experience for you all too? How do you suggest we as individuals look for more perspectives, especially those that we may not be neglecting or be unaware that they exist? So I think all three of us can answer this question, and maybe Garrett, Jada, and Anna too. So I think we touched a little bit on this during the presentation, but I did not know like most of this information before researching. It was definitely a huge learning experience. Like throughout these past 6 months, I have learned so much, and not just about the Vietnam War. Like the stuff that I learned about the Vietnam War, it was really eye-opening to me, and it made me kind of question some of the other wars and some other topics that I've learned about in the past. And it got me thinking like, oh, like are there other sides to these topics too? Like can I be doing better to understand the entire perspective? And as to how I would suggest you guys look for more perspectives, and I think like that's really hard, but I think just being like when you're learning about something, I think personal accounts is one way to really look at both perspectives, like look at a lot of different personal accounts, and also just talk to other people that may have more personal connections to a topic can help a lot. And May and Priya, I don't know if you guys have something to add to that.
Yeah, no, just like Olivia said, I also did not know much about the Vietnam War at all. Like Jada, I only knew the very basic stuff of the war. And adding on to what Olivia said about how to educate yourself, I think also just being like open-minded when learning about subjects, so that if you haven't learned about, if you previously didn't learn about another side to this event or topic, then just being open-minded to hearing about every side and learning as much as you can.
Personally, this war is really hits close to home. I've heard so much about it, and I really wanted to do my own research too, not for this, but before, because I wanted to know more about my parents and my grandparents and what they had to go through. So I knew quite a bit, but having this chance to research more along with Olivia and Priya was really eye-opening and great experience. And as individual looking for more perspectives, I would say research the internet. The internet is out there. There's a lot. I'm sure that there's probably movies, websites that probably try to focus on a different perspective. And sometimes it may be hard knowing what kind of bias that they already put into their film or website, but I'm sure that they'll try their best to show it and educate everyone as well. And so
I can also add to this question. So I think, sorry, one second, let me scroll through the question. Okay, so prior to researching Supreme Court cases, like for the Supreme Court cases, kind of shifting gears a little bit, I would say the only reason why this section is even in there here in the first place is because I emailed my teacher in 8th grade during Asian American History Month. And I was like, yo, what the heck? We haven't learned a single drop of Asian American history. And he was like, oh, shoot, you're right. And so he put together a unit on Supreme Court cases regarding Asian Americans. And I don't know how many members of ECAAR were in that class and how many members remember that section. But I remember being like, it's the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court to me has always kind of been like a boring topic, but like somehow because it was related to Asian Americans, I was like engaged. And I remember Yekwo v. Hopkins, and I remember a lot of these cases from that time. And so I think I did know a little bit about Supreme Court cases, but just doing my own research really helped me to fully understand kind of, or I guess holistically, but not fully understand what the court cases were. And I think Priya, Olivia, and May's presentation on the Vietnam War has really helped me like learn about that side too. Also, in terms of looking for perspectives, the thing I would recommend most is clicking on stories from people you don't normally click on. Like, so one thing in the media that gets like a lot of, like people don't think about this, but if you click on stories from like Asian Americans, the press will start looking at Asian Americans more because they're getting more clicks. It's all about business, right? So if you can give more attention to certain stories that like people and tell the news media in that, like, and by doing that, you tell them like, I'm interested in this, I want to see more of this, the news media will cover it more, and then you get more diverse perspectives. So clicking on things that might not be necessarily like in your wheelhouse or like that you're not initially interested in, and just continuing to do that is really helpful. I know Vox on YouTube. YouTube is like a great resource, by the way. Vox has a channel, and granted it's slightly left skewed, but they do have a lot of content on world politics and things, which will help you see the world in a whole new light as well. So yeah.
To go like off of what Garrett was saying, I can't speak to the research for the Vietnam War because I wasn't part of that group. But when we were like putting the seminar together, we were given the option of what we were interested in, and like leadership, like Olivia and Garrett tried to make it happen. Like if you had a specific topic you wanted to present on, they'd try to put people in groups. And I picked Supreme Court because I took AP Government last year, and I took it in Virginia. I moved here from Virginia a few months ago, and that's not the most progressive place ever to live. But for AP classes, you have to write FRQs, and we had a required list of Supreme Court cases. And so I picked this topic thinking I'm going to be an expert, I'm going to be great at this, I'm going to know all these cases. And then I was like, I don't know anything about Asian Americans in history and the courts, and I've taken AP Government. This is horrible. And I was like ashamed because I felt like that's really messed up that we've had a complete erasure of Asian Americans in an advanced class. That it's not right. And so I learned all of this through the research that we did as a group, and I kind of became more passionate about it through that because I hadn't even realized the extent that the school system doesn't teach it until this presentation. And I definitely agree with May and with Garrett. There's a lot of information that is online. It's hard to know how much of it is biased, but Mark Twain has a quote that I really like. It basically is like, don't let school stop you from getting an education. And I think that, just because something's not taught in your history books doesn't mean that it's not important, and it doesn't mean that you can't learn it from somewhere else. And I've literally like had that conversation with my teacher in front of the entire class. Like, dude, this is world history, not AP European history. What are we doing? And she wasn't necessarily, happy about it. That conversation is probably best had in office hours. But, the point is, these conversations need to be had. And I think it's difficult, changing the curriculum is a lot, but just trying to like ask your teacher if there's any information. A lot of times, if they're a decent teacher, they will be like, hey, here are some resources if you need any kind of like guidance. But the resources that Garrett gave and May gave were really good places to start.
All right, there's a few more questions before we address them. I want to recognize that we're 11 minutes over. So if you have other places to go, we respect that. And I've noticed that there's been like a steady trickle of people leaving. So before everyone leaves on us, I want to say a big thank you for coming. If you have questions that we haven't answered yet, stick around and we will hopefully get to all of them. But for those who don't, Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you guys, and we hope to see you at our next seminar. All right, so the next question in the chat is, what's the main aim of ECAAR? Is it support? Is it activism? Well, I'd say it's a little bit of both. So ECAAR is really new. We founded it over the summer of 2020, and the first and main reason why we founded it was to mainly work on education reform for our own school and other schools, in the state, hopefully, if we get to that level. But now we've become, at least in my opinion, I feel like we've become so much more than a group that is just trying to do education reform. I think we're trying to educate our entire community about topics that are not as taught. And we're also a group that offers support for any, either Asian Americans or non-Asian Americans that want to talk about these topics. And I'll open the floor up for anyone else who wants to talk about that.
I think ECAAR is built on the idea that you can't have real change. You can't obviously our main goal is to get this information into the school system. But when we were researching how people educate themselves, how people kind of learn, we realized that it's not plausible that this will be integrated into the school system soon, especially with coronavirus. And I don't know if you guys saw, but Mercer Island High School has some problems with its staff where they don't really want to listen to us. And so we were like, okay, first of all, this needs to be taken into our own hands. This needs to be something that we educate others about ourselves, because the school won't do it for us. Secondly, the only way to reach that goal, the only way to reach this goal of educating people is basically by building a community. We can't, there's a problem in the Asian American community a lot of the times where people kind of step on each other to try and get ahead. And even in civil rights movements, we have people being like, I want to be the figurehead of this movement. I don't want anybody else to be the figurehead. And that's something we were actively trying to stop when we were founding ECAAR. So that includes building a very positive and supportive community. And so, yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. But if you're talking about goals wise, then I think our goal is ultimately education and stopping racism.
Okay, and I think the last question is for May. So it's, what happened to your grandpa when he went to America, and if possible, how did he feel about it?
Okay, so my grandfather, when he went to America, he went by himself. So his family stayed in Vietnam and they moved back to Hue, and there actually was where my father met my mother. And after a few years, my grandfather was able to sponsor his family from Vietnam to America. And sadly, my father just met my mother, so they didn't get to go on dates, but they did send love letters. And when my grandfather came to America, he worked various jobs. He traveled from California to Texas, driving, trying to get a stable living, to earn money, to get tickets for his family to come over and live in America. And I don't know if I told you this, but at first he had 3 children, but then he had 2 more children. So he had to somehow get 6 people from Vietnam all the way to America and be with him. And I actually asked him about this, if he faced any racism or hate when he came to America, and he said he doesn't remember, and he didn't. So luckily for him, he didn't receive any hate, and he really worked hard to get a stable living. And then his children became successful and lived happily in America. Okay, I see a question. How did my mom get here? So when my dad came to America, he was writing love letters to my mom. And one day he called her on the phone and was like, do you want to marry me? And she said yes. So he flew back and forth trying to sponsor her to America, and they got married in Vietnam, which is really sweet. And then a year or 2 later, she was sponsored to America, to Texas. And then they lived there and then moved to Washington and had me and my sister. So yeah.
All right, it seems like there are no more questions. So, to the people who are still here, thank you so much for coming. As we said, and I think this information's in the chat, we're going to be having another presentation on March 17th at 7 p.m. PST, and it's going to be about the history of Asian American hate and protests and racism and current events. So be sure to come to that if you're interested, and we'll just register on our website for that. But yeah, that wraps it up for today. Thanks everyone for coming.